Hey guys, it's Garrett, or Prowler, from the Split Party podcast. Since we're starting the podcast about 20 sessions into our ongoing campaign, we decided you might want to know some background stuff. So painstakingly, we whipped up this recap. There's some details missing that will probably be filled in when certain NPCs come back into the story. Just to save time in writing, we kind of snipped it out for now. However, I don't want it to sound like I was just reading a script at you for an hour, which I am, so I wrote it as it was being told by a traveler at a tavern. There are 7 chapters and 2 epilogues, so you'll be able to keep track of where you are in the story at pretty much any time. Kick back, and we hope you enjoy our party's history. Chapter 1, Unwelcome Guests. Wyvor, 1st of Stivos, 301st year of Darkreign. Our story began with the first moon. The first of the 2 moons, Acreon, cast a blue gaze on the lands of the Burrock for 2 nights now in wait for his twin. Gabriel had been lucky thus far. Lycans were active when there was 1 full moon, but they were in most cases forced to transform on occasions of 2. The Moon Watchers declared that in the coming week both of the Night's Eyes would gaze down on the continent for 4 nights straight. Reuben was on the battlements with Speaker Corin when the caravan came in from the south of Olstenburg near sunset. Coincidentally, it was the caravan that would bring both Gabriel and Halifax to the city. Corin tasked the young men with watching over their new guests, and Reuben obeyed without question. Reuben was a quiet and strange man. The tavern would have been warm enough for them to share a couple drinks and speak of their purpose in Olstenburg. Sadly, they never made it to that tavern. Not yet, at least. But, mere steps from the door, the newest meteorite screamed across the sky and struck not far out from town, with enough force to shatter 100 men. Rich rock. Shadow steel. The locals would be buzzing in excitement, and as usual the guards would prevent them from leaving the walls. So the newly acquainted Reuben, Halifax, and Gabriel found another way out. Or others had found a way out, and the trio just simply followed them in suit. The difference being that the first group to leave did not return that night. When they reached the meteorite, they found no stones, no rocks, no riches, only a man surrounded by a smoldering ring. Of course, the occurrence was strange, but they felt they couldn't just leave the man there, and Reuben had a way of knowing that the beast was there recently. Therefore, Rylon returned to Olstenburg with him. The next few days were spent sharing stories, hunting bounties, investigating murders, developing camaraderie, and conning the local merchants. The last being mostly Halifax's work. All of it was either interesting or rose suspicion about the town, but not quite as much as the murder in the alley that led them to a home with a tunnel dug all the way underneath it to the Academy of Sword, the prized gem of Olstenburg. And at the end of that tunnel, underneath said academy, there was a powder keg jammed into a crevice just large enough for it. Convenient. Fancying themselves heroes or something, the party attempted to dislodge the keg. Returning and noticing a few unwelcome guests, the residents of this home must have figured better now than never, as they lit the building ablaze and left it to burn. The questions of who itched at their minds for some time. They questioned locals and pondered, and eventually had come to a lead. It was the town crier that lifted the ruse. Not the greatest spy, he had read it himself out, and told the party he had been tasked with coming to the town to sabotage it alongside his love, Matisse. They were promised that if they did well here, she'd be cured of her curse upon returning home to Nova Stoya. It was the kind of curse that provided her with extra limbs and the ability to transform her own pre-existing ones. She was an Eberron Aura, cursed to lose control of herself. The former seraph in Rylon urged him to help her. Oh, the mess it made for them. Rylon, Reuben, and the town crier, Rickton, made way to the Olsten Hall. You see, Reuben had sparked the idea that if the town crier had admitted his crimes to the Lord General Vasily Roma, he'd be pardoned of his transgressions and let to live a life of peace. Lord General Vasily Roma had other plans in mind. The Lord ordered on the spot that Rylon free the crier of his mortal coil and end his life. It was Rylon's response that had made it difficult for them. In a swift word, he cast a spell that could be used to influence the Lord, and it worked, to his credit, but did little to dissuade the man from his order. So when the Lord General had come to his senses, Reuben had made the right decision and plunged a dagger into the crier's chest so deep that he wilted to his knees and crumbled on the spot. Though Rylon's companion had made the right decision, it didn't change much. Reuben was recognized for his work, and Rylon was ordered to leave the walls of Olstenburg within the hour or be sent to an early grave. When they returned to where Matisse, Gabriel, and Halifax were waiting, they broke the news. The crier was dead, and Rylon was banished. In expecting Matisse to be mortified, they had their weapons at the ready. Surprisingly, she received the information well. Richtenweiser may have loved her, but she had never loved him. He was but a means to an end. All in all, it had gone well. But Rylon was still to be gone from the city, so once more, the party wasn't going to just leave him behind. Gabriel, Matisse, and Reuben packed their necessities and gathered food for the journey while Rylon and Halifax procured a carriage. Halifax lied about their return and conned the poor merchant into a bargain that would leave the party very well off. 1 carriage and 4 horses for only 300 Baroque gold crowns. It was practically thievery in more than one sense. Before the hour was up, they left the city, headed east toward Grabenstein. The crier had told them that a seraph was recently torn to limbs in the streets there, and they were already unwelcome guests in Olstenburg. Chapter 2. What Waited. Frixa, 4th of Stivos, 301st year of Dark Reign. You may be wondering what waited out there behind the walls. So did they. East they travelled until nightfall washed over the plains and sparse forests. They made their camp and began to take shifts. Halifax had been having nightmares lately of a room that awaited him in Nova Stoya, his old home, namely the personal room. In it, there was a fireplace as tall as a man and well stocked with wood to burn. He sat in a large leather armchair, so vast it practically swallowed the little man. Between the chair and the rug were rich wood floors, a bare rug, a small coffee table that stood on the bare rug, and a bottle of wine on that coffee table. The bottle's label read, Hugo Grand Vase, Bonasau. Charnot did have the best wine, after all. Each occurrence of this dream had been different in some small ways, whether it be the surroundings or the figures within them, but as all nightmares did, this one too passed. While the halfling was having a nightmare, Rylon was keeping watch over his sleeping companions. The wind gently rustled, carrying with it an ivory feather that drifted from the sky and down to Rylon. Either they were being watched, or this was a cruel trick. There was no reason it couldn't be both. So when morning came, they packed their things and continued east along the road. All was well until they passed the first large forest. In some brief reconnaissance, they spotted a dozen wolves or so. Horses feared wolves, and that was enough reason to steer their carriage around the patch of trees. The wolves kept their distance as they paralleled the carriage around the forest, and in truth things were fairly calm, all things considered. It wasn't until a low and deafening rumble crossed the air that events took a turn for the worse. The beast brought out the worst in all things, both man and animal. The madness that overtook the wolves spurred them to turn hostile on one another, giving the travelers a window of opportunity. Thinking best to leave the area, the fastest route was into the woods and through them. So, using the wolves' aggression against each other as a distraction, they were able to rush past the remaining wolves without much interactions. Running their horses at breakneck speeds was dangerous in such dense fog and made it even more difficult to spot which way was the right way. Luckily, Reuben had a keen eye for detail and led them into an offshoot from the main road which took them into a large mansion nestled into the fogwoods. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, they say. But he stayed with the carriage to watch it as the party delved into the mansion slowly and cautiously. The house was, to their surprise, clear, so they did what anyone would do. They snooped around for secrets and treasures. Their search took them into the basement, where a sarcophagus wrapped in chains awaited them. Well, had to be treasures in that, of all places, Halifax thought. What he found was the body of the first witch hunter, Rolk Olsen. Reuben wouldn't find out his relation to the man until nearly 16 days later, and Halifax wouldn't understand the significance of his treasure until he was separated from it about 25 days later. But for now, he had a dagger with magical vampiric properties that stole the life from his enemies and siphoned it into him. All the while, they were being watched. Enough was enough, and the two spirits bound to the mansion decided to step forth and confront the travelers, a pair of half-elf children that spoke in whispers and cryptic phrases. Halifax wasn't a fan of them, They told the party about the master of the house, that he'd return unhappy to find the dagger missing. Children, eternal or not, were still prone to being swayed by simple explanations, so in the end, reluctantly, they welcomed their new guests and gave them a tour of the home. It was grand, and in the large dining room were paintings of figures they referred to as the Master, Rourke, and the Lich. As it was told, Rourke was the Master's best friend, and the Lich was a friend that had been strayed from the path of good. The trio lived some 250 years ago. The Lich was a dragonborn in his mortal years, but if they had both lived 250 years ago, that didn't explain how the Master, a hobgoblin, had managed to live so long. It made much more sense when it was revealed that he was a vampire. But that too hadn't been learned until 10 days later. Content with all they had learned and found, their eyes grew heavy. Eventually, Rylon and Gabriel fell asleep in the guest room of the mansion while Matisse and Halifax slept in the carriage. Reuben was the only one who decided to stay up all night. Strange he was. He wandered the perimeter of the estate, where he later encountered beings cast as shadow with angry yellow eyes that refused to cross onto the estate's land. Shadow stealers, the children had warned Reuben. Unable to survive in the daylight, and unable to cross onto the estate's land for reasons unknown, they stood at the border and watched Reuben with hungry eyes. Curious, Reuben sat there with the children watching the creatures. He waited and waited and waited too, until morning light broke the treetop. And when it did, Gabriel was the first to wake. Rylon was the last to wake, accompanied by two small birds that chirped at the foot of his bed. They were black with a single white stripe each. Halifax woke up to Matisse and the children waiting there in the opposite seat of the carriage, staring at him. No one would want to wake to that. They watched him, and when questioned, Matisse explained that the children told her Halifax was like them. He was glad to leave them behind at the estate when they left. Chapter 3. Like Ants. Vila, 5th of Stivos, 301st year of Dark Reign. He did end up nipping them in the arse, Reuben that was. Halifax and Gabriel sat at the helm of the carriage while Rylon, Matisse and Reuben sat resting in the back. What a nice carriage it was, comfortable, stylish, and masterfully crafted with premium materials. It could have been a grand day for riding in the carriage, if not for the broken wheel that sent the contraption lurching to a halt. Knowing full well the danger that skulked beyond the misty woods, the group quickly began changing the wheel and scouting ahead. When they finally finished and felt that they were safe, the beast's titanic foot came crashing under the road, crushing one of their horses in the process, and as the looming figure stood above them, watching down with burning yellow eyes, Matisse woke Reuben from his nightmare. Damn, that carriage was comfortable. Coincidentally, the carriage actually did break down, but that wasn't until after Reuben had been awake for some time. When it did break down, a pair of shadow stealers slithered across the shadows cast by the tree branches overhead and under the carriage where they joined the travelers on their journey east. That same day, the party crossed two traveling witch hunters, a caravan bringing back corpses from the front line to Olstenburg, and an inn called Almost There. They were only a couple days from Olstenburg, where they came from, and still 10 days away from Grabenstein, so the name must have meant almost to Olstenburg. Shame. The thing about taverns on the road was that they had to charge a steep price per room. Fair enough they had to pay the mercenaries to keep the place safe so far from civilization, but 20 gold per person? It was an outrage. And though not in the best circumstances, the party got their gold back when the shadow stealers had driven the guards into madness the next morning. The innkeep was the first to die. He died before the party even woke up. So without the innkeep left, and with only one guard who survived the fight, the facility itself had no reason to hold on to the coin, nor the stash of dream leaves that Halifax liberated from beneath the floorboards behind the bar. I say this in complete truth, they were not the bad guys in this instance. When they left the next morning, Gabriel had to bind Matisse's arms to his sides while they travelled. Her curse was getting more and more dangerous for them. It wasn't too many miles from the tavern before they crossed a pile of bodies with their clothes stripped from them on the side of the road face down in the mud. After a long moment of thought, they came to the conclusion that the men headed back toward Grabenstein with the corpse caravan must have been spies from the east attempting to infiltrate Olstenburg. They had already come so far, they couldn't turn back now, or so they told themselves. The most admirable trait the travelers possessed was their uncanny ability not to pester each other into divulging their secrets. And they all had secrets. The level of control was just unprecedented. So when Gabriel stalked off into the night for 4 full moons straight, they thought nothing of it and believed whatever he told them, something like he was hunting or needed some space. Boy, did those nights try him. First they'd be a headache, then he'd be lost in his own imagination. Sometimes there were woods around him, other times there were more lichens. The visions were never the same. But one thing was constant. He'd awake without memory of the previous night, and whatever he did, or whatever he ate. Poor lad. During one of those nights, while Gabriel was off fighting himself, Rylon finally met a source of the feather from the night earlier that week. His name was Stazriel, and he was a seraph of Zabriel. He saw Rylon for what he was, just faithful and caring. Such kind unspoken compliments. So being in search of just such an individual, Stazriel offered the downcast Rylon an opportunity to serve as a seraph once more, but under Zabriel instead of Solima. No surprise, Rylon took this to offense and saw it as an act of poaching. The next night, still during the full moon cycle, when Matisse met that same seraph as she was guarding the others while they slept. This time it was Rylon that got nipped in the arse. Stazriel told the sweet lads that Rylon had been calling them ants and asking toward the sky if he was meant to lead the ants. So now it was Matisse's turn to take offense. When Gabriel had made it to camp the next morning, he arrived to a grand argument between Matisse and Rylon. Halifax had just cooked breakfast and now the mood was soured. Poor halfling, he had just been sleeping well on account of the dream leaves, finally turning things around. Chapter 4. Above All. Tessa, 8th of Stivos, 301st year of Dark Reign. The 4th night was the easiest of them for Gabriel. The vision was short and simple. He stood in shallow waters surrounded by nothing, so much nothing that it smothered him, only him. As he stood there in the calmness, before him stood another image of himself. They spoke briefly and he heard whispers of what could have been, as long as he gave in to the monster beneath the surface. When he returned from the darkest reaches of his mind, he looked to the moons and resisted their gaze. It was that same night that they trusted their carriage to a mad half-elf nestled in the crooks of the mountain's side. The terrain grew rough and too narrow for their vehicle. They paid a small fee and left on horseback the next morning. Among the next couple days, they travelled in relative peace and were graced with a casual check-in from Stazriel one of those nights. Halifax had developed an addiction to the dream leaves by now, which Rylon was angered about but Matisse supported. Hell, if it kept the nightmares away from him, what was the trouble about it? They were all growing in their own ways and as a group. I believe any of them would have died for the other by then. They'd put each other above all, perhaps except Halifax. Words had leg of their own, and travelled quite quickly at that. The words told them that the Order of Dawn, whom worshipped Zabriel, waited in Grabenstein for something and for some reason. It wasn't clear what that something was, and in his visit, Stazriel warned Rylon that misinformation spread like wildfire. He should have trusted Stazriel. The man himself was a seraph of Zabriel, so if anyone were to know a lick about anything, it'd be him. But they treated the next morning like all the rest. Halifax would cook, Matisse would ready the horses, and they'd be packed and off within the hour. Clouds told them in grim shades that it'd rain later that day, and the clouds had no reason to lie, so when it did rain, they weren't surprised. The rain crept across the cliffs with them for the better part of a few hours and into the night. Grabenstein was finally within reach. Now was a good time as any to push through the night, and the rain, so delighted by the idea, pushed through the night alongside them. Thunder and lightning joined them too. Being the weakest equestrian of the bunch, Reuben's horse slipped, which broke not only the horse's leg, but Reuben's too as he was crushed under the animal's weight. Now it was storming, and as Rylon's faith mended the fractures in Reuben's leg, Halifax saw it first. Stories told that the beast stood as tall as the sky, that it looked on even ground with the caps of mountains, and it did. It must have been miles upon miles away from them, but down at the foot of the mountains, It looked them in the eye on even ground. It loomed above all. Amidst the howling winds, the cascading thunder, and the silver veins that rippled across the inky maelstrom above, they saw it in glimpses. And when it saw them too, staring back with those burning yellow coals, darkness poured in from all sides, and the madness forced their consciousness from their straining grasps. Rylon had almost fought it off. It was a good effort, really, but not enough. The beast's influence forced the darkest sides of all minds to come forth, man or monster. The travelers did things they weren't proud of, and in the morning, when they came to consciousness separated and distraught, they were down to 2 horses. Gabriel's sword dealt the blow, but it was the beast who guided his hands. Halifax got off the lightest, having much lighter pockets, no pun intended. Reuben came back covered in blood, which didn't seem to bother him too much. Lastly, Rylon abandoned his holy symbol after casting the contents of his bladder on it. At least, all 5 of them were still alive. Matisse didn't share what she did. The good news was that they were only a few miles away from Grebenstein now. Their travels could have been far, far better, but they could have been far worse. There was reason to be sorrowful, fair enough, but also reason to be grateful. They still had each other above all. Chapter 5, Broken Borders. Frixa, 11th of Stivos, 301st year of Dark Reign. And when they finally, after all this time, arrived at the gates into Grebenstein, they were greeted by a priestess of the Order of Dawn. No, they didn't worship Zabriel, they worshipped Solima. The look on the priestess's face told Rylon that she was pleased with where he led the ants, a spectre, a lycanthrope, and an aberrant aura. The kind of creatures that the Lich had told them to round up and slaughter in the name of justice. He must have made a strong point because they believed him, so for days now they were rounding up freaks at the border city and carting them out to the long-abandoned town of Talstar, located west of Malkovia where the river split. Considering that they needed to gather supplies and secure a place to rest, the party split up and they handled their own tasks. Anyway, when Rylon confronted the priestess because he wasn't about to let his companions get carted off into their execution, he was offered an ultimatum. Either he was with the faith, or he was against the faith. To Rylon, it was her who had strayed from the path of faith. So, as the agents of the Order of Dawn began to set upon his companions and restrain them, he held firm in his words that this was not justice. And expanding forth in a sudden gust from his back were his wings, the pair that he relied on as a seraph. Regardless, wings or not, there was a fight. Gabriel was taking on 3, maybe 4 of them. Well, Halifax had escaped to a roof with his crossbow. Matisse was off running an errand when she was captured and hauled off to the carts which were preparing to depart east to Grebenstein and into Astoria. It wasn't clear what allowed them as Astorians into Grebenstein without conflict, but every other body out east that came its way was shot down. Somewhere along the conflict, Reuben vanished off invisibly and began making way for the sound of Matisse's screams. Gods, that girl could scream. It wasn't tough to find her, but Reuben stopped for a quick prayer to his lord, and his lord sent back a messenger with a magical helm that he'd be given to borrow. In short, the messenger was a demon, but none of the other party members saw it. The phrase was, "Speak of the devil and he shall appear." Casting a mass image or spell along those lines, Rylon conjured forth an image of the beast over Grebenstein. It worked well to scare off the people of Grebenstein into a frenzy until they started to slaughter each other. The beast really was there, standing behind the image Rylon had conjured. Taking advantage of the chaos, they dealt with the remaining member of the Order of Dawn and fled east with Matisse and one other prisoner they had learned was none other than Oscar Runecrest, the master of the mansion where the 2 ghost children had been. Small world indeed. They prodded him for answers, finding that he managed to live so long because he was a vampire. Additionally, Halifax discovered that he was a target for the Lich for unknown reasons. Oscar cursed the Lich's name left and right, claiming that he was raising an army of undead underneath Novastoy and plotted to send it across the entire continent on the next Dark Reign, which was only a few weeks away. With fear of the beast, and fear of the Lich in their hearts, they left Oscar to travel north as he planned, and they themselves began the arduous journey down the east side of the Grey Spine Mountains. and then north toward the woods that would lead to Fallowart, where they'd stop for some time and continue east towards Telstar. It was the next day when they crossed a battlefield that must have maintained a few hundred corpses, along with one man still breathing desperately while he clung to life. East of Gravenstein was a hot spot for conflict between the Burok Empire and the Stoya. Unable to look a good deed in the eye and leave it untouched, Rylon healed the man. The man's name was Captain Alabaster Crane. He bore the colours of Astoria and claimed that the war was not over, so neither was his drive to win it, and trudged off west toward Gravenstein with confident strides. Chapter 6. Alabaster Crane. Muna, 14th of Stivos, 301st year of Dark Reign. Gravenstein marked the border between the Burok Empire and Astoria. Cannon fire and distant muskets carried into the night and down the slopes barely audible from a day away. The beast was not done with Gravenstein's garrison yet, but soon he would be, because they'd all be dead. There was nothing the party could do, so rather than look back and gripe, they moved forward with their new cart and their horses. Not long into the second day, they learned that Alabaster Crane was cursed to this land by the Lich, which was later confirmed by the people of Fallowart. They weren't there yet, but it was easiest to tell you that now and avoid the confusion. Every few miles they'd see him standing along the side of the road, and when they finally got a chance to speak with him, he was there for half an hour or so and then vanished into black wisps. He couldn't live his life, but he couldn't die either. A true curse. Back to the woods though, as the woods were just up ahead. The woods played tricks with them, made them see things that weren't there. They weren't the only ones. Mindlessly standing by the sides of the road, the lost, as the people of Fallowart called them, were stuck there in a trance or a dream of sorts, so convincing that they never wanted to leave it. It was only natural that Elifax tried to pester them upon spotting one of them, and as he disturbed their pleasant trance like a hive of bees, they began to swarm the cart. That was enough to convince the travellers that it wasn't worth standing around and being mauled to death. Funny enough. Crows cawed and swooped down to peck them as they fled, and the lost came pouring from the forest and surrounded the narrow road. Miles passed like this, and then the commotion died down. They'd be safe enough to rest, so they did. Matisse was the third to hold guard shift, and being as tired as she was, she dozed off before her shift was over. Up until now, their time in Astoria had been a few days shrouded in darkness, as was typical of Astoria. But not this morning, no. This morning it was bright as a blue sky day with passers-by going to and fro down the road. Halifax's reaction was the most extreme. He demanded that he be told what was going on and even attacked one of the poor people trying to go about their pleasant day. 3 days passed as they travelled in the sunlight, but to them it felt like one long day. Stasriel was the only guiding force that kept their horses moving, lest they would have stayed there like the rest of the lost. The problem was that they couldn't see Stasriel. They were in a trance set upon them by the forest, and it decided how they saw things. Crows had been morphed into pleasant birds, the sky had been sunny and blue, the wandering lost were dressed nicely and given the blush of life on their cheek. But all things come to an end. You'll learn that, and they surely have by now. When they abruptly came back from the trance, they stood a few hundred feet from the walls and watched as a hanging man swayed from the tree beside them. The sign on his chest read, "Witch Hunters Unwelcome." Yeah, this was Fallowart. And the charlatan halfling was their ticket in. He was a natural when acting. So as he pulled together his act, the guards pulled the gates aside for Alabaster Crane to come riding into town with his entourage. Chapter 7. Until then. Frixer, 18th of Stivos, 301st year of Dark Reign. It was impressive how well they were received in Fallowart. Turns out that Alabaster Crane was a better known name in these parts than they had assumed. Hells, they were greeted with stories, care to their horses, rooms, baths, a very hefty allowance for dinner. Can you believe they charged 10 platinum for a dessert? The Bat Riders flew all the way to major cities for trade, and they brought back with them a dessert from Morentia. They called it the Madness of Morentia, and it was drizzled in aether blood. I digress, it must have been great. With some time to relax, they explored a bit, did some minor trade, and had a few drinks. Rylon went to the house of Solimar within the city. Reuben spoke to the smith to order a new helmet after having lost his in Gravenstein, and the others went to their rooms for the night. Matisse, Rylon, and Halifax had their own rooms, while Gabriel and Reuben had to share one. There just weren't enough rooms available. Popular place. Each room had its own bath, and steaming water was brought to the doors. It was a gem of a city, it was. The only strange part was their obsession over some man called the Druid. He didn't have a name, or at least no one seemed to know it, so they called him the Druid. Reuben was one of the last to crawl into the bath. He was still covered in blood, so as it washed off and mixed in with the water that Gabriel too had used, it was now a murky brownish red, enough blood for Kirill to arrive through his strange portal. With him, the demon brought Speaker Corin from Olstenburg. As Corin's news would have it, a caravan of Asturians disguised as a corpse caravan from the border city made their way into Olstenburg and began to slaughter the people. They were stopped, but not before much damage was dealt. Strangely, that was good news for Corin and Reuben. When they were all eventually in bed, Rylon's thoughts swirled around the words of Faloart's high priest of Solima, Letiaga. He told Rylon that a darkness loomed over one of them. It was alien in nature, something unfamiliar, not natural to this plane. Sadly, they woke just hours into their slumber. There was commotion outside in the center of the city. Midnight had come, and with it, the return of the Druid. Tired and annoyed, they peered from their windows to see the commotion. Across the street, gathered around what the people called the Cedar Door, was a crowd. Not wanting to miss what was going on, the party gathered their supplied dress clothes, because theirs were being washed courtesy of the tavern, and stepped down the stairs and out into the Asturian dark to shuffle into the crowd. On his way to the stairs, Gabriel stopped by Matisse's room to check on her and make sure she got a new dress. It was red, just like the one they had first seen her in back in Olstenburg. That time was only about 20 days ago, but so much had happened. His thoughts snapped back into the present moment when her door opened. It opened just a crack, just enough for him to see her, and for her to see him. She had a mutated form with bony tusks jutting from her shoulders and a pocked skin covered in beads of chitin. He didn't shy away, didn't grimace. He understood what she was going through, and didn't press the matter when she told him that she wanted to stay in her room. Gabriel left the dress with her, and parted down the hall toward the stairs with a smile. When they were all together down in the crowd, I could see the followers of Solima, the council, guards, the citizens of Faloart all gathered there. Then the cedar tree split, warping and cracking until it held in the center of it a black portal as pitch as void, with dark mist pouring out along the ground. Shouts of excitement rose as the druid stepped forth from the door. His wood wards, which were like tree people that were about human-sized, guarded him attentively. The druid spoke when the crowd grew silent in anticipation. His words rang out dull and deep. Bad news followed him. Something stirred beneath the city of Novastoya, and it would wash over the land when the next dark rain came. In his stride, he beckoned the party to follow him, and so they did. They learned much about their family histories, and that somehow such important figures as themselves had come together by happenstance, or fate. Reuben, the lineage of the first witch hunter, Gabriel, the lineage of the second witch hunter, Rylon, the lineage of the third son of Taustar, then Halifax, that was yet to be discovered. Where they were going, Matisse would not follow. She was offered a chance to be taken back to the Ravencourt sanctuary to be cured of her curse, as a show of good faith from the druid. She was hesitant, but the party encouraged her. They would see her again, they said. As for them, the druid told them that they need to mass forces to struggle against the building army underneath Novastoya. People followed names and lines, but power too, and that was something they lacked. There wasn't enough time for them to carry out the task together, so they said their bittersweet byes, prodded the druid for leads on which ways to go, and the party split. Be safe, they told each other. Until then, they said. Now that the party was split, that marked the end of the first arc of the campaign. It wasn't until a couple episodes into the second arc that we decided to start recording and uploading our sessions, so to cover the gaps between the split and the present sessions, we have for you the following two epilogues. The first covers the travels of Halifax and Rylon. The second covers the travels of Gabriel and Reuben. You're almost caught up, so let's get into it. Epilogue 1. Misfortune spread like wildfire. Rylon and Halifax rode with Scanner Side, a bet rider, down southeast toward Void. The Bat Riders were trained well and knew the safest places to rest at night. Being that their means of travel was direct and high up in the air, most threats couldn't bother them during the day as they flew through the darkness. Most threats. An undead worm, ridden by a vampire, was the threat they were not safe from. But Rylon's quick thinking left the vampire plummeting toward the ground hundreds of feet below after his flying steed was banished by a spell. On their 11th day, they landed a few miles from Void, and Scanner flew south with her bat, Creel, toward Morencia. Halifax and Rylon were alone again, but not for long. Sometime around then, an entity known as Foscatil, who was part of Halifax now and had been for some time, made himself known. He appeared in Halifax's dreams at first, appearing as a mirror image of Halifax with green eyes. Then, he started to show up in illusions outside of Halifax's dreams. He could speak, but not be interacted with physically, and others could see him and hear him. Entering into Void, they crossed a man at the gates being denied entry on the grounds of being a Southlander. That meant he was either from Charnol or Castanella, and it surely wasn't Castanella with that accent. As it would have happened, Void was under a lockdown due to the spread of a highly infectious disease transferred by bite. It was called the Tears of the Ungerer. The mayor of the small town had fallen victim to it. Time cures arrived, or healers trained enough, the infected would have withered away and died. Such was the disease's nature. Rylon was a healer in some ways, and for such, he was granted entry and allowed to bring the Southlander in with him, whom introduced himself as Amon le Bescon of Charlon City Bonasau, if that's how you say it. The first stop was the jail where the infected were rounded up and being held behind in cells. There, Matisse's father stood behind those bars, snapping and flailing desperately for anything to bite. The guard told them that the mayor had a son and a daughter, Matisse and her infant brother she had not yet met. Far be it from Rylon to leave the town without blessing the child, so he did, and in doing so he and Halifax spoke with the night graduate Dow Ride that watched over the baby, an Unterfolk knight that abandoned his people to flee east. Dow spoke highly of Astoria and the Lich and told Rylon and Halifax that the Burok Empire was dying and would assassinate anyone that spoke too openly of it. He feared that the disease was brought here by agents of the Burok, a target set on his back when he abandoned the West. Could have been true. Dow trained some of those men that infiltrated Ostenburg recently. These were his people now, and he felt for them. Sadness aside, they did all they could in that town and moved on toward Novastoya. It was fastest to travel off the beaten path, but it was far more dangerous. Any refuge was worth consideration if it hid them from the horse-sized bats and roaming creatures of Astoria. So when they came across a mansion with a shrine memorial in the yard, their interest was piqued. It peaked furthermore when they found undead wandering the area and attacking anything that was deemed unwelcome by some unknown set of rules. The undead didn't seem to bother them though, and they strolled up to the ruined mansion without hindrance. It was then that they had met the Lich and the undead Seamus Ferron, the second witch hunter and the ancestor of their good friend Gabriel Ferron. The Lich, now known as Averex, introduced himself and spent the better part of a few hours explaining things to Halifax and Rylon that they had been lied to about. As a show of faith, the vampire that was responsible for the Seraph's death in Gravenstein was being held captive in the basement. He stepped over the agreed terms between the Lich and the Blood Drinkers, and as punishment, he would be starved to death. Avarax took them to see this, but then left them to make the decision for themselves. Would the vampire continue his slow death or be given a quick mercy? Quick mercy was the verdict after he was deemed too far gone to be saved spiritually. Following this, Fascatil and Halifax had a spat about what Foss wanted to be done next. Halifax, ever to challenge a foe, disagreed with Fascatil. In a sudden rage, a rift opened between Halifax and Fascatil, and Foss pulled Halifax into it, where the two of them would return to the Aether, where he was from. Within this realm of creation, the spark of all things birthed into every plane, there awaited an army of Foscatils and the body of Talstar, the god that came before Solima. And as the rift between planes closed, Foss spoke the words that they'd return one day. When Foscatil had retreated back into the Aether with Halifax, the darkness over Astoria withdrew with him. The Astorians would be able to grow crops again. The Blood Drinkers would be forced into hiding. A new era on the horizon for the Astorian people. Daylight would kiss their skin once more. They said their farewells to the Lich, both Amon and Rylon, and continued on toward Nova Stoya. Rylon's heart was heavy with loss. Epilogue II, The Withered Warrior. Gabriel, Reuben, and Speaker Corin stepped through the cedar door and into the cold north through the evergreen. The druid could not follow them where they were going because he'd have to wait until the next day to return. Even magic had its limits. It was a stark contrast to the mild cold of Astoria and the Baroque Empire. In the north, snow as tall as their knees lined the ground, and the cold wind bit their cheeks and ears. But that wasn't as immediately noteworthy as the ongoing attack against the evergreen. Warriors of Thule, accompanied by a primordial fire, were fighting axe and flame against the wood wards that stood guard over the tree. It was no competition. The wood wards were capable of some extent, but they were far outmatched in this fight. When the blood was shed and soaked into the snow, they stood amidst those corpses. The warriors and the primordial and the wood wards were all dead. They had almost saved one of them, but almost was never enough in these cases. Their only healer had gone southeast with Halifax. From the mountain cap they arrived on, just southeast of Cindergas, they could see across the frozen sea and all the way to the mist-shrouded volcano's mouth. It was a sunny day, still very early, and the snowfall was only light. That meant there was still plenty of time to travel down the mountain into the edge of the frozen sea before night fell, so they did. It was lucky enough that they found a traveling band of northern merchants out on the frozen sea. The merchants allowed them in after doing no more than confiscating their weapons. They'd received them back when they left. It was probably nice for them to be greeted with warm stew and relatively secure place to sleep. And it was here that they met Tamakti. He was fairly vague with who he was, but his goals aligned with Gabriel and Reuben's. They were all seeking the trials of the Withered Warrior. The Withered Warrior was a figure that once united the 6 clans of the north to raid and fight against their neighboring enemies. He did great by northern standards, but as the name suggests, he quickly began to wither and retreated to the only warm place in the north where a tomb could be built for him and he would rest for eternity until the next man came to face his trials. And when they faced his trials, if they passed them, they would take up the fabled magic items that he led the north with. The merchants told them that if they survived the trials, they'd be welcome to raid the east coast of Etheris with them if nothing else. But they'd need to make it to the ships before they left the morning of the 22nd of Stivos. Currently, it was the 19th, and it'd be a day's travel up the volcano into the mouth of Cindergas. They'd be cutting it close, but it was doable. They left in the morning after another warm pot of stew, and began their ascent. Tamakti came with them. About nightfall, they had reached the tomb. It was guarded by 10 representatives from the 6 different clans, and 2 mages that watched over vats of cold fire. The fire's cyan light, combined with the gentle blue gaze of the 2 half-moons, gave the snow a beautiful hue of ocean shades. They gave their golds and riches to Corin to make the best of it in the case that they didn't survive the trials. And it wasn't until an hour later that they emerged from the tomb alive. With them, they carried split among them a ring of silver with a glowing blue sapphire, a set of dull steel half-plate, archaic and proud, and a claymore as dark as shadow steel with the words stitched into it, sharp as the blade. They were outsiders, but the tools they now possessed carried the weight of leadership. The weight of the Withered Warrior. With that, we conclude the recap of our story thus far. We really hope you enjoyed listening to the story, and hope that you enjoy the story ahead even more. Until next time, never split the party. Catch you then.